Welcome to the Fundamental Baptist Podcast. There are many types of Baptists, but being a Baptist once meant that you were a fundamentalist. Over the years, many Baptists have strayed from the fundamentals and thus attacked those who remain true to the faith. This podcast will address the issues surrounding what it means to be a fundamental Baptist.
Somebody said, Brother House, fundamentalists are changing, aren't they? No, fundamentalists don't change. Folks quit being fundamentalists. God says when the troubles come, He said, fight. You can't fight. He said, withstand. You can't withstand. He said, stand. What does it mean to stand? He said, don't change. What? Don't change what? Number one, don't change what you believe.
Here we will reason concerning the Scriptures about the doctrines we hold dear. We believe in souls being saved, lives being changed, and Bible doctrines being strengthened by the Word of God. We believe in the local church, soul winning, missions, and everything taught in the King James Bible.
I thank God tonight for this wonderful Bible. You know, I thank God it's a perfect book, and I love the Bible. Doesn't need any addition, no correction, nothing taken from it. Thank God tonight for the Holy Bible. I like it just like it is.
We are not ashamed of being fundamental Baptists, and we want to encourage others to remain true to the Bible, their Baptist heritage, and to not change what they have been given.
You just stick with the book. You can't beat this book. Why does every generation feel that we got to change it just a little bit because our daddy did it like this and our granddaddy did it like that, and let's change it just a little bit? You change it, and things that are different are not the same. The same commit thou to faithful men.
Thank you for joining us in our discussion of what it means to be a fundamental Baptist.
Welcome, David Baker here, and welcome to the Fundamental Baptist Podcast. We're glad that you're here. I have a good friend with me, becoming a good friend, Brother Tim Pledger, missionary, then pastor, assistant pastor, and we had him teaching Sunday school this morning. He's preaching in our church tonight, and boy, just enjoyed it. I love missions and the heart for missions. Many of my best friends are missionaries. I've been on mission trips to Africa, Mexico, Philippines, New Zealand, and a few other places, and love it. But the Pledger has been to how many countries?
122.
122. I didn't know there were that many. No, I did. But 122 countries. So I wanted to interview with Brother Pledger and his ministry, and I really want you to get this because we are commanded to get the gospel to the world. Who is? You are. Who is? I am. He is. Our church is. Your church is. And so many times we think, okay, that's just impossible. We can't do it. If God said to do it, then we ought to do our best, die trying to do it. God said we are to preach the gospel to every creature. And so that's our job. I would rather try with everything that's in me to do something and fail than to say, I can't do it and not even try. So for the Pledger, I want to hear about life, the basic stuff. So salvation for you, growing up, your call of God. Go and tell us that.
Okay. My dad and mom got saved in 1967 at a revival service where my dad was living in DeSoto, Kansas. 2.5 years or 2 years after he got saved, he was called to preach. And in 1969, the year I was born, he left for Bible school. And so wow. I was a kid growing up in Pontiac, Michigan at Midwestern Baptist College, Emmanuel Baptist Church, under the ministry of Dr. Tom Malone, who's now in heaven. And when my dad finished school, he went to pastor in Arkansas and started a church. Typical independent Baptist preacher looking to start a brand new church, started in our household, eventually rented a storefront and then got a building of her own. And so while my dad was pastoring there at the age of 9, God began to convict me of my sin. I went to church on a Wednesday night, and we had a guest preacher that night, and I didn't walk forward to be saved, but came home after the services at 9 years old, December the 5th, 1978, and got on my knees and asked Jesus to be my Savior. And so life as a preacher's kid growing up, I probably learned the Bible just in Sunday school and at family devotions and things, and then Amen. When I was 15 years of age, I was back out in Pontiac with my dad. He was pastoring up in Vermont for 6.5 years when I was a kid. And went out to Pontiac again for a day called Founders Day, where they'd have guest preachers come from all over. And Dr. Tom Malone got up on an evening service and preached a sermon. I remember it like it was yesterday, entitled "Seeing Sinners Through the Eyes of Jesus." And as just a teenage kid, I surrendered my life to preach the gospel. Felt like God was calling me into ministry. And then finished my high school years. My dad, in my senior year, took a church in Florida where he's pastored the last 37 years called Calvary Baptist Church in Middleburg. just outside of Jacksonville. And so because I could be a town student, I drove back and forth to a Bible college there in Jacksonville under the ministry of Dr. Bob Gray at Trinity Baptist, and graduated in 92. When I finished school, went off to Africa, to Nigeria, West Africa. Got there in 96 after raising support for about a year and 9 months, and then started churches in the southwestern part of Nigeria. Was there for right at 6 years, and then in 2003 went to Brooklyn, New York, and pastored an old Baptist church called the 6th Avenue Baptist Church. And so was there from 03 to 07. In 07 went back to Florida and began to work with my dad and his church. It's been really the honor of my life. I've enjoyed ministry in a lot of other places, but to be able to serve alongside your dad, I know your parents are members of the church here in Tennessee, and to be able to serve alongside your family is a great blessing. And so anyways, started a ministry in 2008 there at our church called the All Nations Outreach Ministry, and that became the thrust of our local church, taking the gospel to the third world and around to different nations. And so now, as of last October, been traveling with our missions ministry, trying to share with local churches like here at Family Baptist in Columbia about how that we're helping indigenous pastors, and me and my wife are excited. Pray for my wife. She's taking care of her 90-year-old mother that lives with us there in Florida with late-stage dementia, but we travel and try to bring awareness to the importance of getting the gospel to the ends of the earth through indigenous pastors and church planners. And then I'm going to be in Kenya this month, September, and we're buying a piece of property there to help one of the Bible schools. And Kim and I are building a house there, and just to be able to give us an East African base. And so appreciate you allowing me to be on the podcast today, and appreciate you allowing me to be at church this morning.
Man, love it, love it. So much in there I want to ask you about. Interesting. So your first deputation going to Nigeria, a year and 9 months, is that right?
Yes, sir.
So did you go under-supported? Did you raise support quickly? Usually it's 3 years or so. So
Yeah.
What did God do there?
You know, you said something to me yesterday just in conversation. I reflected back on those days after you mentioned this to me. But you said that a missionary goes into the church, and if he has a heart for service and trying to help the local church, witness, get there early and knock on doors. I was green. I didn't have much experience outside of just being raised in a preacher's home, and a little bit of experience in Bible school and things, and my dad's ministry there in Florida. But in going to churches, I drove to any church that would allow me to come. I was in a lot of missions conferences in those days, but I did a lot of extra door knocking in the churches I'd be in. Wow. Of course, being a young man in those years, at the age of 26, 27, preachers would give you opportunities to preach, and so I pretty much cut my teeth in preaching, going to churches, you know. And so, God blessed, met a lot of great people. Didn't go under supported. In those days, you didn't have to have as much as what's required today. I think I left in 96 with about $3,500 a month of support. Went to a city called Abeokuta, Nigeria, and I was also helped out a lot in those early days by older missionaries. Brother Mark Sigstad was there at the time. Awesome. Just other men. I met Brother Maskey in those years and got to stay at his house with him. Wow. David Long. They all sort of took me under wing and treated me like one of their young kid brothers and stuff, and taught me a lot about missions really in those first couple of years I was there.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. We talked some about that because, boy, the world needs the gospel, and we send missionaries out, and it takes them many times more than that. Do you know the percentage? Just curious, how many missionaries start deputation and don't finish?
I've heard, and they're old statistics. Yeah. I heard many, many years ago, and it was Brother Doug Calap that I read some of his writings, and he talked about it, but it was a very small percentage. I won't quote it exactly, but it was in the low teens or maybe the high 20s of all of those that start deputation that eventually make it to the field. And then the statistics of those that stay beyond the first 4 years was even more smaller than that. And so it's rather sad. But it just shows that if it was easy, everybody'd be doing it. Just the challenges of it, trying to raise support, pastors not knowing who you are, and trying to discover more about you as you're meeting them for the first time. But God can do anything, and God's blessed us in traveling this time. I've been in some wonderful churches. Brother Baker, just in traveling the last, 9 or 10 months, some of the choice, not just pastors, but the choice servants of God that serve in local churches, their generosity, their kindness, it makes you feel like you're part of a greater team, you know, in meeting some of the folks that I've met these last many months.
Awesome. Which brings us to a lot of what I've enjoyed the hours we got to spend yesterday and talk, and I don't know how many hours we talked, but it was a lot. And curious in this, the mission trips I've been on, and looking to see and think, what is the best way to get the gospel to the world? What is the best way to multiply what we have? What's the biblical plan? How can we work within that? What can be done to do more? And you mentioned a few times when you gave your introduction of indigenous pastors. So explain that why. That's not the typical missions route that's done, but explain that why, what you've seen, and then after that, I'm sure people will have those thoughts. What are the potential problems?
Yeah.
And I wanted to let you know he has, and we've thought through some of the potential problems to be able to fix those. And so don't turn it off before, because automatically your brain is going to go to the problems.
Yeah.
And yes, in everything, we're talking about this already, but there's problems in marriage. But there's a lot of blessings in marriage, and so you don't not get married because there are potential problems.
Absolutely.
Oh, there's problems with having kids. Okay, but you don't not have children because of potential problems. You see, how do we fix those potential problems? The same way in this. So tell us about indigenous pastors. Why with them, and how to help them.
And let me say this: I've never been in missions an either or. I don't think that you have to discard the importance of the American missionary in order to help the indigenous pastors. I think that there has to be, in the body of Christ, just like in your local church, God gifts different people to meet certain needs. I look at the role of an American missionary as being a certain gift that God has gifted them just from our very nature of their background. When they go to the field, they help in so many different areas, the maturing of those local men, the Bible doctrines that they bring with them when they come. But why the indigenous pastor? I go back to the book of Acts. I have studied and I've listened to people over the last several years that have studied diligently the life of the Apostle Paul, for example. And Paul was not a stationary pastor in one location, building a big church and then sending missionaries or local pastors out. He was traveling from place to place and rarely stayed more than 2 or 3 months at a time in a place. But he was doing the work of what we'd call today a missionary, one that was sent. He was sent out of the church at Antioch, and of course the connection there with Jerusalem. But in each of these places, when folks were won to Christ that were the local indigenous converts, they were trained there, and then they were in turn made into the local pastors in Crete and in Antioch and these places where Paul went. And so why the indigenous pastors? I think you have to look at the biblical pattern, but then from a practical standpoint, and I think this is where there's probably some places where we go overboard in helping at times when we should allow things to grow organically in the gospel. But I look at like the longevity of national pastors. I know it's probably an overused argument, but I've met a lot of missionaries, and I was a missionary for 6 years in Nigeria, and there's almost a shelf life to missionaries that go overseas. It's not that you don't find the Rick Martins that stay for 40 years and are diligent, and other great men of God that leave America behind. Probably in my father's generation and in my grandfather's generation, there were missionaries that would stay on a field for 30 and 40 years and were perfectly contented and were able to continue the work of God. In our generation, for example, Pastor Baker, in 1970, among Western evangelical missionaries, you can do the research on this, there were 400,000 Western evangelical missionaries scattered around the world. Today, they're right at 200,000. So the world has grown like this, and the number of missionaries coming out of the West, at least, have diminished greatly. And so that's reflective of our missionaries in independent Baptist churches as well as others. Someone said this, they said, and I believe it to be close to the truth, there are near 100,000 independent Baptist churches in America, the average attendance being about 70 in attendance, which makes about 700,000 of us. Well, out of that 700,000 of us, less than half of 1% of those become what you would call professional missionaries. So we're not producing enough missionaries even to reach the world. The indigenous pastor works because of his longevity. He knows the culture, the language. He's not having to adapt. He knows how to survive in a harsh climate. That's one reason. But he also has the ability to train his own because of the understanding of the culture. Many of us that even go to a foreign field, you could spend 20 years. I've been learning the African culture since 1996, and I've probably scraped the surface. When it comes to relating to Africans, I feel like I know the African people as an American, but I'll never be able to reach them like their own people. Ezekiel, I sought for a man among them. The among them indicates that if God's going to save people from Tennessee, it's going to be volunteers that reach their own. Amen. It's the same in Florida. It's the same in Africa and Indian Asia. And so our heart's desire has been knit together with the indigenous pastors because they know how to adapt to circumstances that most Americans struggle to adapt with, and it gives them longevity, and because their own people will receive the truth from them much better than they will from an outsider coming to preach the truth to them. Those are some of the things that led us down that road. Yes, sir.
It's really good, and I know I've seen that, and I don't know the people listening if you've been on any mission trips, whatever, but I've been in the Philippines 6 or 7 times, and we always had missionaries there that we would meet and connect with, but typically we went there to help the national pastor. And so Dr. Army Jasalva in Cebu took over. He's a medical doctor, and he got reached by a missionary, and the missionary got cancer and was going to die, and he said to Dr. Army Jasalva, he said, I want you to take the church. I'm not a pastor. And said, I feel like God wants, he could have called another missionary, he could have given it, but he felt like God wanted Dr. Army Jasalva to take it. And Dr. Jasalva is literally, sometimes they call him the Jack Howells of Asia. I mean, he has planted hundreds and thousands of churches with his people all over, and he was indigenous. He's from the Philippines, and the people that they reach has just been amazing. And so not just with them, but different other Filipino pastors to reach and to see what they're doing, and they know the culture. They're not going to quit and go home. Of course, they can quit the ministry, but they don't need the income that Americans need to be able to come over, raise support through years of reputation, and then they're undersupported. They've got to go back on furlough. The national pastor doesn't have to do any of that, just practically to train them to be able to do that. By the way, I did want to say, and you did too, however anybody's preaching the gospel, we're for them, you know?
Absolutely.
And so you want to go to a place and build a big church and have a college and train them. They're doing a great work. We already mentioned Rick Martins and guys like that. It's a great model, and it's done great. They've done a super job. But in looking to see, okay, how can we help? If God didn't call me to go be a Rick Martin there, but how can I help, and where can that money be used the best to take and help those indigenous pastors? I remember being there and teaching them, and how much they just soaked that up, and they wanted it to be trained where they could reach their people, and which is a definitely biblical model to be able to do, and they're not going to, quote, leave and go back home. They are home, and with some help, I think we can help build and grow so much more of that. So transition to that, how can we help? What people listening to this podcast right now, or churches that want to do that, how can we help the indigenous pastor to be able to do that? And how do you know they're good? Because we get, on social media all the time, fake messages from people. We have no idea who they are, if they're good, if they're bad. We just give them money and find out. I've heard of churches over there. They have an outbuilding, and it has different church signs depending on who's coming to visit. They're Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopal, and they just change their sign when that person's coming to visit. So you hear of things like that, and we're afraid of we don't want to be a scam. So how can we help them without hurting them?
And social media has linked the third world to the West, and American people and Westerners tend to be very compassionate towards those that suffer and need help, and so no doubt that's a Achilles heel in missions. What we did is we began to take our own members to the field. We became acquainted with those that we were working with, so that if we got to a place and we found a good man, but it didn't seem like he had a kindred heart for trying to reach his own people, but was a decent pastor, we'd help by being there that week. But we began to make real close relationships with those that were evangelistic, that were extreme in their doctrinal soundness, that were reproducing themselves. And so as our church members were coming back, and our own, myself and, my different ones that were traveling with us, we just developed relationships that became sort of the main cogs in different regions of the world. And so we have several ministries now, several avenues, I should say, where we're helping the indigenous church planters. We primarily help in 6 different areas, and I can name a few of those in a moment, but those are areas that our church took it upon ourselves of, these are some men that we believe in. I'll give you one to start with. About 19 months ago, we started a ministry, Brother Baker, called our church planting ministry. A local man finishes his Bible training in a third world, and he needs a little bit of a nudge to get out and get going sometimes. Africans and Asians sometimes will start a church under a banana tree. God bless them for their labors. But they'll reach more people and get off to a better start if they just have a meeting place. Yeah. So we would donate. We started this a year and 9 months ago, or a year and 7 months ago, 19 months ago, donating $600 to that church planter. We wouldn't send the money to that young man, but we'd send it to the person that trained him, like Brother Mark Holmes in Nigeria. Right, we'd send the money through him, and he would utilize that $600 when that fellow was getting ready to start a church in renting a building for the next several months. Sometimes that could rent several spaces in a building. Sometimes if it was in a village, they'd build a little lean-to with a pole barn kind of thing, tin roof and some benches. And $600 doesn't go far here in America. But in a third world context, it can give a start to that ministry. And so our members begin to make those commitments. I'll support a local church plant. And then we would connect our member with the church plant being started and with that local pastor, and he would give us a report in the first service. And as a result of that, it was sort of like adopting a new church, a new pastor, and our members could pray for them. And so just since January of this year, even outside of our own church, 13 different churches have helped us start new churches around the world since January. And it's a one-time commitment. When we give it, they give a report on how the money's used. They're men that we can trust because we've been to their location. Good. We found those that were training them. So one of the things I would say to every pastor and to those that are listening, they're part of local church leadership, is you got to get to the field yourself. You've got to build those relationships. Yeah. We'll certainly allow you to come alongside us and help us doing what we're doing. We're not going to refuse the help. But the reality is you'll develop a greater heart for those regions of the world if you'll get your U.S. passport and get on a plane and dedicate yourself to going, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, however long you'll be gone. 90 of our church members have been to the mission field the last 15 years, and many of those go on a yearly basis, and it's revolutionized the heart of giving even within our local church. So go to the field, get to know the local pastors, the indigenous pastors, who that you can trust and who's reliable, who seems to already be doing a good work. Don't find guys that are waiting to start, but guys that are already doing something great, and then get behind them the same way you would do an American missionary. You look at a track record and you say, this man's been pastoring, or this man's been an assistant pastor, or this man's been trained well. He's a good investment. That's the way we do our indigenous pastors as well.
No, I love that. And if you hear, Brother Mark Holmes, great guy, great missionary. I've been in his church, preached at his church, and he's had somebody go through their Bible Institute for 2, 3, 4 years. He knows them. He backs them up. He knows they're a soul winner. He knows their character is right, their morals are right, their finances are right. He knows that. And so what a great way to partner with our missionaries, Absolutely. With the indigenous pastors, because we don't live there. We don't know. He may have a good show, but Mark Holmes, no, I've known this man for 4 years. Here's Absolutely. His character, here's his ethics, here's his work, and you get behind him and support him. What a great connection way, because it's not up to individually, we're supposed to do all we can, but boy, to partner with the missionaries, there's our partner to help them to reach the world. So.
Let me give you an example of that, if I could, Brother Baker. There's a young man that got saved there in Brother Mark's ministry in Abuja. He was a converted Muslim. He was of the Fulani tribe, and his name is Hamidu Usman. Hamidu is a fervent soul winner. He went through the school. I think he's still got a year left before he even finishes, so he's not officially pastoring now. Yeah. He considers himself a student evangelist now. But young Hamidu will go on his own dime to villages and use one of our Jesus film packs to evangelize Muslim communities. We put together this pack, cost us $700 for a pack. We use the Jesus film, which is in over 2,000 languages around the world. And we put it on an SD card and put it in a small projector that can be packed into this Home Depot bag, tool bag, and it gets in there with a battery pack and a big amplifier. You can show it on the outdoors, and large crowds can come around and hear the gospel. And our local pastors and evangelists will take that Jesus film equipment. They'll show a gospel film in the open air in the local dialect, and people just gather around. Mm-hmm. And when they preach the gospel at the very end, give an invitation. Just last month we saw, and we have 73 of those that are scattered around the world right now, but last month we saw 6,200 people come to Christ as their Savior. Hamidu Usman, out of an American missionary's work in Abuja, Nigeria, is the fruit of his labor, and now all we're doing is coming alongside a young man like that and say, let us help you reach people for Christ in your own culture. And so, as I said earlier, it's not discounting the work of the American missionary.
Yeah.
Thank God for those men and women that are scattered around the world sacrificing for the gospel's sake. But our job is to leave something perpetual that will be there generations later. And eventually, the best of missionaries are coming home, and they're going to retire, or for health reasons, or emotional struggles or financial struggles. They're coming home, and when they do, there needs to be an indigenous churches in each of these areas. And so that's why we invest heavily in the indigenous pastor.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
We've already said it, but the protections to make sure that you're not investing in some scam or things like that, you either go there yourself, you see, you meet, you talk, you work with, you make sure they have that, or you're working with that American missionary, or that even Dr. Armitage Salva, that they put their stamp, and we trust them, and they trust the other person. So you have that connection of trust. So you're not wasting anything to find out that you've been, funding some scam out there, because there are scams out there.
Yeah.
One of the dangers, how many people won't fund true works because they're afraid of being scammed, and where you can have protections in place where you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, and I would say this, that in every ministry, whether you're pastoring a local church here in America, supporting national pastors or American missionaries, every one of us could tell horror stories of people that failed miserably, took advantage, wasted funds, what have you. So it works both ways. You can have indigenous pastors that get in the ministry for the wrong reason. You can also have American pastors and missionaries that get into ministry for the wrong reason and end up leaving the ministry because of their own lust or their own desires. And so some of the checks and balances are exactly what you said. If we know those that are training them, and if we've come alongside them, a good example, Peter Thamai is an Indian pastor in a city called Dimapur, India, which is in the northeast corner of India, near the Bhutan border, Bangladesh border, Nepal border, not far from Myanmar. But in Dimapur, there's a tremendous Bible college and local churches, Bethlehem Baptist Church, and their Bible college has produced, listen to this, over 600 graduates. Not all of those, of course, are pastoring. Some of them are young ladies that went to school to get education, degrees, and so forth. But every one of those young men that have come out of there and started a new church is doing an outstanding job. We started 4 churches last year, Brother Baker, in 2022 in Bhutan. And in Bhutan is a closed, restricted nation. 800,000 people living in Bhutan, almost exclusively Buddhist, with about 10% Islam, and about half of 1% of the Bhutan population claims anything Christians. Churches are illegal. The gospel is illegal there to be preached openly. And so from the ministry of Peter Thamai, that has been to our church, that got trained here at a Bible college in America even, and then partly in Bangalore, he has been back there with his own people, reaching his own folks. And so we have confidence in him, and our confidence in him says, man, when you're ready to go start a church, we want to come alongside you and help you. And so it's finding people that you feel endeared to and that you feel like are grounded, and folks that are going to be trustworthy. And then it's getting behind that guy as he trains his men to go preach the gospel and start new churches. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I wanted, with the pleasure, to come on here so you could hear him. When I mentioned the 3 main purpose of this podcast is to push back on some of the false doctrine and changes that many people are doing. Number 2 is to introduce you to good pastors and missionaries, and that's a part of that. And then 3rd is to train and equip you to make sure you can be a good witness. But I wanted to expose you to his ministry. So I want you to tell us about your podcast so they can follow you and go find that and listen to episodes. Tell us about your podcast and what you're doing there.
We started, Kim and I, my wife, we started the podcast. We're on our 57th or 58th episode. We do one a week. We started that last year for the purpose of, Brother Baker, I had just met some of the greatest servants of God. I'd be in a place, for example, in Pakistan. I was with a man by the name of Asher Shahzad in Lahore, Pakistan, pastoring a Bible Baptist church and has a seminary and a Bible college there, has trained dozens and dozens of Pakistanis to preach the gospel and to go out and start independent Baptist churches. And Brother Asher, as I was there with him preaching in some of the ministries and teaching in the Bible school, would talk about the persecution of the Pakistani people and Pakistani Christians. He talked about coming out the door one day and going down the street from his church in Johannesburg, and a suicide bomber blew up himself in front of a group of Christians, and I think killed 18 or 19, maybe more than that, believers coming out of their church. They were having services on Sunday, which is unusual for primarily Muslim countries, and many got killed. And Brother Asher was there, his wife was there. He said, Brother Tim, it took my wife probably 3 months to recover just from the mental trauma that she saw, the emotional trauma, people's body parts lying on the street, and yet he's there serving the Lord. And as I'd be with these people, I'd think, man, these are heroes of the faith. Yeah. These, I'm a minor player in the gospel, and so I'd say, boy, if I could ever introduce people of America to Brother Asher, or if I was down in Honduras preaching at a church and met a guy named Yeri Martinez, and Brother Yeri's wife less than a year ago, passed away with cancer. And while he was telling me about his wife's death while I was there, he said, my little 10-year-old daughter, when her mom was taking her last breath, said in the Spanish language, she lifted her hand toward heaven as a 10-year-old and said, as her mom died, absent from body, present with the Lord. And I thought, boy, what a story of grace and mercy, and it made me feel so honored just to be there with him. And he's still pastoring, started 2 churches, Brother Yeri, and just a godly man. And so we started the podcast. It's called All Nations Conversation, and it's on Spotify and Apple and Subsplash, and we have it on our church website. But we started it mainly so that I could introduce pastors and church laymen and Bible school students to men and women of God that I had met all around the world that were just great servants, great stories of grace in their life. And then secondly, I think, this is just my opinion, I think that a lot of times in ministry, Brother Baker, we reproduce whatever we know. We don't really think outside the box. Right. We support missionaries where we know others have gone. We support them maybe 4 and 5 times of the amount being supported in this region as opposed to other regions where the gospel's not even named, And so as I would travel into some of these hard areas where you don't find too many gospel preachers, man, I'd meet people and I'd say, there needs to be more emphasis upon this region of the world. If I'm putting this up on my podcast, somebody's going to listen to it, and maybe some young man sitting in Bible school is going to start saying, I'm going to pray about going to that place. And so it was to expose the regions of the world that I felt like were being neglected, and it was to introduce great servants of God. And if you get a chance, a new episode comes out every Tuesday. If you get a chance, click on there. And we're not professionals in doing podcasts, but we know people that are great servants of God, and we want you to know them.
It's a good podcast. I've listened to it, and I recommend it, and I hope that you will. We need good independent Baptists putting together good podcasts of information and connecting that. So I love what he's doing. A couple things before we're done. How else could people support? If they say, you know what, man, I want to do this, okay? How could they support you? Of course, prayers, finances, going, you got a trip coming up. I mean, any way, if they want to be a part, what's available for them?
I mean, any way that I come to churches like yours to try to find ways that we can partner together and find ways of mutual ground for the gospel's sake. If you'd like me to come to your church and explain what we do with All Nations Outreach Ministry, Amen. We're raising support all the time for that. But I've had members and pastors just recently make comments to me about they want to go on a trip upcoming with us. If you'd like to go on one of the trips, we make 5 or 6 major trips per year out of our church. I go on several of those. I'll be in Hong Kong and Taiwan in the month of November. This year I've been in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and I've been down to Congo this year. In fact, you're talking about Brother Gisalva. When I was down the Congo, I was with a man that we were supporting, and his name is David Mwepu. He went to the Philippines and got trained at the Bible school in Cebu, wow. And then he's back in the Congo. We've helped that guy start, or he started, I should say. We've helped him on some of them. Brother David has started 14 new churches. Wow. He's a young man, probably in his early 30s. His dad was an independent Baptist preacher, and so he's got a good Bible training. By the way, to show you the love that those Filipinos have for the missions and for preaching the gospel, Brother David married a Filipino woman, and in a period of a year and a half, traveled to over 500 churches on deputation. Wow. Imagine traveling. Those of us that are American missionaries and we complain about traveling and being on the road all the time. Imagine in a year and a half traveling. On some Sundays, he would be in 7 churches. Imagine that. and he raised just minimal, support compared to what we need.
Yeah.
And he's back in the Congo. He's got 3 Bible schools. We've helped him on several churches. And so if you'd like to help us, if you go onto our church website, I wish we had our own missions website, but we have our own church website, and there's a drop down to our missions page. So you go on to www.calvarycares.net. That's our church website where my dad has pastored for 37 years. And then you click onto our missions page, which is called All Nations Outreach Ministry. And it's got a segment on there where you could give if you decide to give online. And it would allow you to choose segments. Like if you wanted to buy a Jesus film pack, it allows you to give towards that. A church plant, it allows you to give towards that. We do motorbikes. And so, or you could have me come to your church. You could reach out to me myself through email. My email address is simple. It's tpledger2@gmail.com, tpledger2@gmail.com. I'd love to answer any questions you might have. I'm not an expert. I don't know all that there is to know about missions, but I love the gospel. I love people being saved. I see people saved everywhere I go, and then I love church planting. And so our heart's desire, we started this church plant ministry now 19 months ago, a year and 7 months ago, and we've been able to start 139 new churches, independent Baptist churches, in 32 different countries. And it's only because we've gone to these places and have learned who the nationals were, learned where they're getting trained, and now we feel commitment to the fact that when they're ready to start a new church, we've got to come up with the funds to be able to start that church. And so that's our heart's desire, is the salvation of the lost and church planting.
Awesome. Everything you say has 3 or 4 more questions. I got to hear about the motorbike. So tell me about the motorbike ministry and why. And side question, what is the most amount of people you've seen on a motorbike?
A lot. If I was guessing, in Africa, I'd say, or maybe in India. I've seen a lot in India too. But I'd say probably the husband, the wife. I've probably seen 5 kids on a motorbike. So I've probably seen maybe 7 sitting on a motorbike. That's what I was saying. In Philippines,
I've seen 7 or 8 people.
They stack them on the handlebars and on the gas tank and back here. We buy motorbikes for $1,000 in most places. Sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, but it's probably averages to $1,000. We buy just the small versions, the probably 450 cc's or whatever they'd be considered. India makes them, China makes some, imports them into all these countries. And we buy them because if you can imagine trying to do ministry outside of your own walking distance, an African will get a bicycle sometimes, and that will work for a certain range. But like in the Jesus films, we're sending guys way up over top of mountains. We're sending them down into 25, 30 miles away. They're going on ministry to try to reach and start new churches in the villages. Well, you can only do so much by foot or by public transport even. Think about public transport. You're traveling out to show the Jesus film, and it's 9 o'clock at night, maybe 9:30, and the film's finishing. You're packing up your stuff. Now you're heading 25 miles back home, and there's no taxis now. Yeah. And there's no buses running. And so you're on foot and you're having to sleep in the village, or you're, being there really, really late. And so we started doing $1,000 for a motorbike. We bought several of them. They're scattered all over. We have some in India and lots of places, Uganda, Congo, Nigeria. And we just buy them for the purpose of helping those pastors and evangelists that are already proven themselves to do the best with what they have. We want to expand their reach, their influence, and so it's been a great blessing. I got to tell you this. I was in a church just last week in Ohio. A lady came up to me after church with tears in her eyes, about 45-year-old lady, sweet lady, been a member of that church for 3 years where she got saved. And she said, "Brother Tim, I want to give you my motorcycle." I said, "Give me a motorcycle?" Yeah, I never had that approach. And she said, "I got a Harley Davidson. It's only got 12,000 miles on it. It's worth about $8,000, and I want to give it to you to send to Africa or somewhere." And I thought, I cannot give that Harley Davidson to an African running up and down the streets. And so I said, "Would it be okay if we sell it and then we take the funds from that? $1,000 a motorcycle, you can sell an $8,000 motorbike here and send the money overseas and buy 7 or 8 of those things." And so that's what we're doing. I said this to you. Some of the most gracious people in the world are people in Baptist churches that are just common people, working their jobs, loving the Lord, loving their family, and trying to make a dent for the gospel. And I thank you that are pastors out there as you're in the trenches weekly, as you're trying to develop a servant's heart in the minds of people and the hearts of people, and you're doing the hard work. I'm coming behind you and reaping some of the benefits for missions that you've laid down for years and years. And so our heart's desire is to find these different tools, really, the Jesus film, the Bibles. Many African pastors, Indian pastors, Pakistani pastors, they don't have any Bibles to even give to a new convert. And so we have a Bible fund that we operate. And so any way that you'd like to reach out to us and just get ideas from us, I think it'd be a great thing if every church of like faith had their own hands-on ministry for missions, where it wasn't just sending out checks and getting letters, but you were taking groups of your own members. It will revolutionize your church. Take teenagers, take the older folks, Amen. People that just want to serve the Lord. We'll get somewhere and have a guy that's a plumber, have a guy that's a carpenter or a bricklayer, and while we're out knocking doors, he's back at the church helping around with things like this. And so everybody's been gifted by God. Use your talents for the gospel.
Amen.
Yeah.
Beautiful. It's a pleasure. Thank you. Appreciate your ministry, what you're doing. Love the ideas. Can you imagine if we all use our gifts, talents, and abilities to be able to do what Brother Pledger's talking about? Every church in America did this. Boy, how many churches could be started? How many tens of thousands and millions of people could be saved if we did this? It really is a big deal. So thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time. Please go listen to the All Nations Conversation podcast, okay? Go listen to that wherever you listen to them at. And then go to their website, www.calvarycares.net.
Yes, sir.
calvarycares.net. And pray about what God would want you to do. Buy a couple motorbikes, buy a Jesus pack, help start that new church, or buy Bibles for them. Gigantic things that we can do to be a part, and go on a mission trip, okay? It'll change the world, it'll change your life. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless you. Thank you for the pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Fundamental Baptist Podcast. If you have any questions, you can email us at thefundamentalbaptistpodcast@gmail.com.